Hi, everyone. Welcome to Embouchure Etiquette. My name is Dr. Lindsay Leach Sparks, and I am the flute professor at the University of Akron. Thank you for joining me virtually today. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make it in person, but I think that hopefully I can give you some really great tools to use with your flutists back home in your ensembles and your private lesson situations with this presentation. So what are we going to be talking about today? First, we're going to introduce the embouchure and then talk about how you form the embouchure and then put the embouchure on the flute. I know we probably covered most of this in music ed methods way back when, but it's good for a little review. And then I think maybe I can give you a couple of kind of new pointers with those two elements there. Where does the airstream go? Talking about, how to get the airstream to actually go into the instrument, in a meaningful way. How to manipulate that airstream without sacrificing pitch, and maybe in some ways only manipulating pitch. What are some other ways that we manipulate sound with our embouchure? How to know when there's a problem with the embouchure, and some common bad habits with the embouchure, especially some things that may have cropped up during our quarantine time last year on COVID when everybody was online 100% of the time. So when we're talking about how to form the embouchure, first thing that I do, I tell my students to say Winnie the Pooh. And this is a picture of my lips. You want to try to encourage a bit of a pucker or even a kiss shape, or some people say to frown, just a little tiny bit. Whatever it is, it should be natural to what the student's lip shape is. We want to try to avoid the smiling embouchure, right? To have these really, really tight corners. That is just going to decrease our flexibility, basically, with the with what we can do with our embouchure. One thing that I have found helpful over the years is some coffee straw practice. So frequent your favorite coffee shop and see if they'll give you a stirrer. This is actually a straw from a kitty cup, but it's about the same size. So one thing that we want to do is make sure that the aperture is about the size of a grain of rice. So if you say Winnie the Pooh, and you've got just a little pucker here, the top lip has to come down in a way that forms a bit of an oval. And the coffee straw is a really good kind of reinforcement of that. So you can say Winnie the Pooh, and that straw should fit kind of right between the lips. This is really great, especially for students whose apertures are too wide. So, it all depends on the student. Everybody's a little bit different, but there are some that try to make that first embouchure shape, and their aperture is the size of a dime, and that's obviously not going to make a good sound. So getting a little bit of straw practice in can really help with that. I've also seen people spit rice. I'm not sure that we want to do that in a post-COVID band room, but that is another way to do it. And so it's about the size and shape of a grain of rice, that aperture. What other things we can do before we even get the flute out is to make sure that the flexibility of the embouchure is there. And so that's what I'm talking about with moving the airstream. And again, you may have done this in methods classes, but what I like to do is put my hand out in front of my face so everybody can do this. Don't move your hand, and don't move your kind of head on this axis, right? You want to keep everything as still as you can. What you will move is your jaw and your lips and the shape of the embouchure, right? So between the two lips, sort of which lip is more prominent, pushing the air either up or down. So if you have your hand here, what you want to try to do is take your airstream from the top of your fingers all the way down to your elbow, and then back up to the top of your fingers. And so you want to manipulate it in a way that is fluid, but also localized to the lips and to the aperture and to your jaw, without too much tension. And a lot of students will harbor tension, especially in their jaws. What that ends up doing is keeping our teeth closer together than they should be probably. A lot of people don't think about their teeth when they think about embouchure, but it does determine, the space between your teeth basically determines how wide or how narrow your embouchure is going to be, the aperture anyway, between the lips. So if the embouchure or the aperture is just a little bit too small and a little bit too tight, one thing you can do is take your thumb, or have your students take their thumbs, turn it sideways, and then put it between your teeth. That's about the amount of space that you want to try to have in your mouth when you're approaching the flute, but even just when you're making the embouchure. Now, again, everybody has a different kind of thumb, different shaped thumb. You might have students with overbites or underbites, and that's going to change this just a little bit. But in general, we probably have more tension than we need most of the time in our jaw, and that is going to kind of make our teeth a little bit too tight together. So it's a very common problem to have, and that kind of reminder about how much space we need is a really, really great tool to have in your back pocket just for opening the embouchure up. So putting the embouchure to the flute. And again, some of this might be review, hopefully some of it's new. What the ideal setup would be is to find this space in here where the bottom of the pink part of your lip just starts to touch the rest of your chin. So you want to find the edge of the pink part of your lip. That edge is going to touch the inside of the aperture hole here. So it takes a little bit of finding, a little bit of doing, and a little bit of experimenting. You want to try to keep the flute, if at all possible, sort of on a flat plane to your face. So we don't want it too far forward. A lot of students try to look at their hands, right? Too far forward. And you don't want it too far backward. This is very uncommon unless you've got a very crowded band room and your flutists are trying to squeeze in between each other. So we're trying to keep it kind of, on a flat plane to our face, right? And we're finding the very bottom edge of the aperture hole with our bottom lip. So with that, you probably will cover about a third of the actual embouchure hole. Again, everybody's lips are different. I actually just taught a student this week that had a very big bottom lip. And it was like the first time in about 5 years, I said, I think you need to move your flute up a little bit on your lip, because most of the time the flute is too high. And it's much easier to get a sound when it's higher, but then you sacrifice a lot of tone and flexibility with the pitch. So keeping it down lower is usually where we need to be. And I would bet that the majority of students don't know to find the outer edge with the very, very bottom of their lip. So it covers about a third of the hole. The bottom lip should be visible. So when you look at an embouchure, there's my Winnie the Pooh, right? When you look at an embouchure, your bottom lip should be visible. And it's because the bottom lip has to come out to manipulate the airstream, to be able to move the airstream up and down. If at all possible, really try to avoid the kiss and roll method, right? Where you kind of do this, you kiss your flute and then roll it. Most of the time, it doesn't get the flute low enough. I only had one student that ever had to do the kiss and roll, and it was because she had a root canal where she had some nerve damage. So she couldn't feel this part of her lip. And so without being able to feel where the embouchure hole was, that was the alternative, was the kiss and roll. And even at that, she had to, find the spot and then move it down. And that was just kind of her method, right? So most of the time, like 99% of the time, the kiss and roll method is just not going to get you quite low enough. So, better to experiment with a camera or a mirror with the students and try to make sure that they kind of get an idea of how low is the correct spot for them. So once you're in the right spot, what happens to your air? Well, the air hits the far edge of the aperture hole. This is what we call a strike edge, and it splits. That's a very, very important thing for this instrument. We don't have a reed. We don't have a mouthpiece. Like we don't have a brass mouthpiece that we touch. So it's imperative that we kind of get that split as close to a 60-40 split as possible. I had a colleague, classmate of mine from CCM, who actually had her undergrad degree in physics. And for her doctoral dissertation, she did an entire experiment with an artificial embouchure and a head joint, trying to figure out, what was the ideal split of this airstream. Turns out it was something like 58.9% of the air actually goes into the flute. Everything else goes across the flute. So it's not quite 50-50. We do want a little bit more in, but again, getting the flute down far enough is probably going to take care of that extra 10%. We don't have to roll in too much. In general, I do tell my students to avoid rolling wherever possible. Instead, we talk a lot about the different ways that we can raise or lower pitch, and just with our lips and with the flexibility of our embouchure. And I love the garden hose analogy for this. So a lot of people, don't wash their own cars anymore, but I like to use this story. So if I'm washing my car and my garden hose, it doesn't have a nozzle, it's just a regular old garden hose. I'm not quite next to the car. What can I do to get the water to spray out fast enough to actually wash my car? One of the easiest things you can do, and most everybody gets this right off the bat, is put your thumb over it, right? Put your thumb over the side of the garden hose, it starts to spray out. That is equivalent to making our aperture between our lips smaller. So we can do that. We can make it a little bit smaller, and the air that's coming out will get faster and more direct because the opening is more narrow. That's one way to do it. It does come with some risks. So like we said earlier, you could have too tight of an aperture. And we're going to see later that will affect the pitch in a way that it's going to go up. If you're in the third octave and you're already sharp, you probably don't want to narrow your aperture because it's just going to make you sharper, right? What's another thing that you can do besides putting your thumb over the garden hose? Well, you can raise up the garden hose, right? You increase the angle of where the water is coming out of the hose, and it's going to go farther. Okay, so raising the airstream up over the flute with the bottom lip, which is why it's so important for the bottom lip to be seen, will actually take care of, the majority, I think, of, manipulation issues when needed with your embouchure. We don't want to roll the flute. Again, this is all just with the bottom lip, getting it up over the flute. So what else can we do? We can also turn up the water at the pump. Right? With our garden hose analogy, if you increase the amount of water that's coming out of the hose, it's going to go further. And we can do the same thing with the flute aperture. So we need to somehow increase our airstream, put out more air, and without actually changing too much of what's going on here with the lips, we are going to increase the pressure, right? The air pressure, and that usually is going to raise the pitch, or say we're going from the bottom octave to the top octave or second octave, we're going to be able to go up, from one octave to another. So those three things are really important. Those are the three kind of ways that we can easily manipulate pitch with our embouchure and in kind of manipulating the air and the sound that way. So what are some common things that we're going to want to do that then may warrant some of these changes in our embouchure? We might want to taper. Okay, if we have soft dynamics or a taper at the end of a note, we're going to want to push the bottom lip out, get the airstream up to avoid going flat at the end of the note. This is really, really important, especially in the low and middle registers. And especially the middle register where we have any of the left hand notes. So G, A flat, B, C, even up to D. It just has to do with the kind of the compact nature of the left hand, and how Albert Cooper, when he created the kind of the modern scale of the flute, push these keys down just a little ways. And so we end up with a slightly longer tube and kind of the tendency for some of those notes to go flat anyway. So if we have a taper, I don't know, let's just say I'm tapering A, okay? Right, I'm really pushing the bottom lip up and trying to get that airstream out so the angle is a little bit different. I'm also maybe, closing the aperture just a little bit. So maybe a combination of some of the first two items in our garden hose analogy. Accents, loud dynamics. Maybe we want to play nice and loud, right? Most of the time when we play loud, we're going to go sharp. The way to remedy that is to open the aperture. So just like when we wanted to taper and not go flat at the end of note, and we were kind of squeezing a little bit of the aperture closed and then getting the airstream up, we're going to do the opposite of that, right? For a note that is going to be on the louder end. So we want to open the teeth, right? And notice I'm saying open the teeth, don't drop the jaw. They're essentially the same movement, but again, I'm trying to take the tension part of this out of the jaw. I think we just in general carry it maybe too much. So opening the teeth is my preferred method of delivery there. But anyway, if you open the teeth, it makes the aperture a little bit wider, a little bit taller. The space between the lips in general can accommodate the greater volume of air. Okay. In the third register, this is especially important because we just really end up with kind of what I like to call a laser beam sound in that register. It's just way too direct. And so we're trying to kind of accommodate the airstream that way. So right, as opposed to where my teeth are closed and my embouchure is less flexible. I'm keeping it nice and tall as much as possible. Support. Obviously, this is a little bit of a debated issue. Is there support? Is there not support? Do we support? Where does it come from? I have studied with teachers who live and die by support, and others that thought it was a 4-letter word. So it kind of, you run the gamut there with that. So I do think that support is a thing. From what I understand in my own body and my own playing and what I've seen other people do, it is an isometric exercise. Isometric in that your diaphragm muscle, which is the big dome muscle, right? The diaphragm muscle is actually pushing up to get the air out. Your core, your rectus abdominis, your obliques, your intercostal muscles, everything in your core, the abs basically, are pushing in and even down, maybe just a hair. So this opposition is what I'm calling the isometric exercise. I am not a physicist or a biologist, but somehow this pressure actually increases the airstream pressure, specifically the speed of the air. And you're not necessarily increasing the volume with this. So the question is, okay, so let's say you explain this to your students, you say, hey, you need to support so you don't go flat. How do you know that they are supporting anything, right? How are they going to know that they're supporting anything? One thing that that is really great for a support exercise is just playing sustained pitches. So any kind of long tone exercise that you really love for your group can be done like this. What you want to do is sustain a piano on any pitch, doesn't really matter. And as long as you're sustaining and you're not going flat, hopefully your core is engaged and you're supporting at the same time that your lips are kind of editing the airstream, the air that's coming out. So Anything with a tuner, is perfectly fine to do just about any register. If you're familiar with the Trevor Y books, he does this starting in the middle register. And that's usually what I do as well. So right, you just hold it as long as you can with a super stable volume and stable pitch. Most of the time you will do a combination of the support and help from your lips in directing the air. And when the two of them are working together, you'll be able to create that very, very stable pitch. There's also a little bit, if they're able to do this, there's a little bit of kind of a balloon effect that happens right under the diaphragm. And I think it has to do with the abs pushing. And that's another indicator if you're able to do a single-handed note like A or B or G and have your students kind of hold right under their ribs, just to double check that there's an engagement there. They should be able to feel a little bit of a balloon there. The best way to manipulate pitch without compromising focus or dynamics is to change the air direction with the lips. Like I said, has to be a little bit of support from the core as well, but mostly with the lips. Really try to avoid rolling the head joint in or out. We don't want to cover the embouchure hole any more than than that third that we started with. And a lot of the reason behind that is it cuts off a lot of the harmonics and it makes it very difficult to tune, which you've probably also experienced in some of your ensembles, I would imagine. So what are some other ways to manipulate sound? And this goes hand in hand with the embouchure. So one thing that I love to talk about with my students is spinning the air. And this is not my idea. This is from William Kincaid. It's from a book called Kincaidiana. This is published by the National Flute Association, if you're interested. But Kincaidiana was written by John Krell, who was a former student of Kincaid's and a colleague of his in the Philadelphia Orchestra for many, many years. And Kincaid had methods for everything. And this was his method for preparing the airstream for a leap. So this is very small, and I might be able to make it a tiny bit bigger here for us. Just there we go. So what he would say, and we're just taking an example of the A to A octave. So A in the first octave, A in the second octave, is that the A in the first octave, let's say it's 10 miles per hour. Okay, I'm sure it's not, but okay, that's the speed of the air. And the A in the second octave is twice that, right? That's how our harmonic series works. And so we've got 20 miles per hour. When we go up, and this is the spin that's happening here on this ascending little trip. So when we go up the octave, we have to actually increase the airstream before we get there. Now, the idea is increasing the airstream so that then your fingers and or lips will be able to pop the upper note out right away. Notice though, A in the bottom octave and in the middle octave have the same fingering. So in this case, it's really all just lips. Okay, so we're increasing the airstream, and then when we're ready, the bottom lip has to pop out, the airstream goes up over the flute a little bit more, and then we get the upper A. And it does sound a little bit like a little push through the air. So that everything is supported in a way that we don't have any cracking notes or kind of wobbliness when we get up the octave there. Tension in our left hand. I think, again, we don't want to maybe say the word tension. It might actually bring tension where we don't want tension. But what I'm talking about is the pressure that you feel right here in this little knuckle, pushing your flute toward your face. There are 3 contact points to the flute, right? So the embouchure, which pushes outward, I should say the chin probably pushes outward. The thumb in the right hand also pushes outward. And then this fulcrum piece in our left hand actually pushes inward. The more that we push inward, the lower the pitch is going to be. relatively. And the more that we release the tension here, the more that our lips should follow the flute, and the angle will change, but also the amount of resonance changes. And so our pitch will go up. Okay. And one thing that I like to kind of demonstrate with this, if you hold your flute out away from your body, okay, you get a pitch when you pop the A key. Okay. If I put it next to my body and I'm not going to play, I just have it up by my face. Right? So just the resonance of my body, of my oral cavity, having my embouchure ready to go, that has brought the pitch down, right? So there's that factor to work with there. So as you are tapering, for example, you might release your hand, release that tension a little bit. It will change the angle of the air here. But you can actually get the pitch to go up quite a bit, just playing with the tension of that left hand. Embouchure shape we talked about a little bit ago, where I said, you could have a nice big embouchure where you have something the size of a dime. That's probably not going to give you a very focused sound. And you might have a super duper tight embouchure. That's basically the first garden hose analogy, where we're putting our thumb over the water. We're kind of manipulating the airstream in a way that pushes and then relaxes the sound. We could try different vowel sounds to go with our embouchure, and that will manipulate the sound as well. One thing that I have my students do all the time is sing and play. And for two reasons. The singing literally does create an obstruction in there where your vocal folds are getting in the way of the airstream. So you're forced to kind of use a little bit more core and push through more air to get your flute sound to come out. And then also our soft palate is part of our oral cavity that we don't often tap into unless we're singing. And we really should, as flutists, be able to tap into that. That's how we're going to create all these vowel sounds. So darker colors would be an E or even an OE or an I sound. If you ever studied German, the O with an umlaut is kind of where we're going with this. The embouchure typically widens and flattens when we do that. And so that focuses the air down. So your air comes up, you have a very high embouchure, or sorry, a high soft palate, and probably a high tongue with an E or an I in there as well. And then the air is kind of driven down with that wider embouchure. And we get a very kind of dark, gritty sound. Right. In terms of the sing and play, you can actually sing those vowels and play at the same time to get the idea of the soft palate moving. The vowel sounds that are opposite that create the lighter, more hollow kind of colors are going to be the ooh and the ah and the o sounds. So these are low, round, kind of soft palate sounds. The embouchure typically becomes rounder to accommodate, again, a less direct airstream. So right, we're just changing the ooh and the e to get a sense of the soft palate. And again, the embouchure kind of goes along with those changes. So what are some exercises that we can use to manipulate these things? We're talking about air supply and the really dark color, the flat embouchure that has a lot of very direct air. I like to direct my students to the Tapenel and Gobert #1. Now, this is from a book called The 17 Big Daily Studies. It's actually on your handout, and I'll go over that in a minute. It's available on IMSLP in its entirety. This is just the first 4 lines. But what I like to do is play 2 lines together, if possible, with as big and ugly a sound as I can make. Okay. So to the point of cracking, and then back off just a little bit. And then you know how dark, of a sound you can manipulate. So. I did actually crack in there a little bit. And I like to hold out the tonic at the end, just again for air supply, just to kind of practice that aspect of support. The lip exercises that I endorse are whistle tones. They often work best in the very, very, very high register. You have to have a very relaxed embouchure for whistle tones. Maybe like a high B. I tell my students to find the hootie sound, that sound with the high fingering, and then relax the air in the embouchure even more, and you get that whistly effect. I like to also practice oscillating harmonics. And what I do is I start on the middle B and I go up a fifth to F sharp. So what this means is I'm playing B and I just overblow. So I'm training my embouchure and my ear to hear that upper fifth, overblow, and then I oscillate between the real note and the harmonic note. And then I go down the octave to kind of end that portion out. So. Okay, and that really does force you to manipulate your air, or I should say manipulate your lips in a way that the air can get that upper harmonic out for you. Also with harmonics, these are really listening exercises that I do without a drone. And so the harmonic series for flute is, kind of a basic one where you have an octave, a fifth, a fourth, and then goes on. And what I do is I actually play the notes I play the C, I finger the C the whole time. Okay. And then we play the notes up above that in the series. I play them until I am very, very confident that it is the best, most beautiful sound possible. And then I switch to the real note. So. Right, and it goes on. Now, the thing about the higher register, we're using fingerings that aren't real fingerings. We say they're real fingerings. They're really vented fingerings that are replicas of the lower octaves. So what we have to do here, like for example, my E was just a tiny bit higher than my harmonic E. That's okay. We just want them to be as close as possible without sacrificing the quality of the sound. And then you know that you're not going to be too covered or airy, one or the other, right? You've got that 60-40 split working for you. There are also, again, if you're familiar with the Trevor Y books, I don't have any of them out right this very minute, but Trevor Y has a series of books. He's a British flutist, has been around forever. He publishes them on Novello, and he does a series of bugle calls with harmonics, and it's essentially the same thing. You can kind of manipulate the airstream with your lips, and then you can double check some of those notes with kind of the real note to make sure that you're as close as possible, and that makes it much easier to play in tune with yourself. So the last exercise here that I want to share is, well, there's actually two of them on this page. There's one that is a listening exercise with a drone. So if you have a way to play a drone, which I do, I think. If I can get pitch, here we go. No, There we go. All right, so I'm going to do a D. So that's my drone D. And I'm not going to talk over it. So I will play a D in an octave, and then I'm going to fill in the chord. And what I'm listening for is I'm listening for my pitch compared to this drone, which is just your stable note, right? So you can do this in any octave. It's a really great exercise for piccolo. If you have any budding piccoloists in your ensembles, just getting them used to the intonation of that instrument, making sure that they know where things sit, and you know, allowing them some long tone time with the idea that you're also training their ear. All right. So anyway, the last exercise here is an exercise for support, and this is support with the lips. So this is from the Moise de la Sonorité. It is, I put the hairpins in underneath. That's not printed in his edition. You can repeat each of the kind of I don't want to say oscillations, can repeat each of the half steps if you want to, or you could just kind of, you know, go straight down. I encourage my students to do this out of time because it is, you know, useful to have a nice long piano note where you can check your core, like we were talking about earlier, check your support and check your lips, you know, as long as you can hold it on, on those second notes. So, and again, ideally this is with a tuner. You don't want to, I personally don't train my students to glue themselves to the tuner. You know, it's a tool, it's a machine. It's going to hopefully train your ear. But this is a good one that can be easily memorized. It's just chromatic, and you can kind of, you know, use your eye as a guide for your ear in this case. So. And then the rest. And it's also a great exercise for tapers. If you're again manipulating your embouchure in a way that that taper, you know, kind of pulls the aperture together, and then also the bottom lip comes out, and we adjust the airstream to try to keep the pitch up. It's a great exercise for them. So now we've covered all of these things. How are you going to know when to apply them? When is there a problem? If you hear spitting or buzzing noise, and I mean not the buzzing like singing and playing, I mean like a almost like a trumpet buzz, right? Usually that means that your embouchure is way too tight. This happens fairly frequently on piccolo, actually, especially new players, and they're starting to kind of get used to how small that embouchure is, that aperture for that instrument, and it's very common to have a little bit of spitting and buzzing happening. Encourage your students to widen their teeth, right, and make it a little bit of a taller, wider embouchure. Reinforce support from the core, and notice that I'm saying core and not diaphragm. I know there's probably a lot of debate about that too, but your diaphragm essentially is an involuntary muscle. We have a little bit of control over it in terms of holding our breath or pulsating it a little bit, but we really don't have the kind of control that I think a lot of people attribute to it, that we think we do. So whatever that is in your core that's creating the support, which would be, again, kind of your abs and obliques and intercostal muscles in conjunction with the diaphragm muscle. If you have a student who is consistently flat, okay, someone who it just seems like their tone is flat in addition to their pitch being flat, right? Because they are kind of two different things. Check that the top lip isn't too far over the embouchure hole. Okay. Even if they're only covering a third of the hole closest to them, it's very possible that students with an overbite fall into this category. And in that case, it's even more important to make sure the flute's down low, to do straw work with them, and to do a lot of mirror work with them so you can see the bottom lip, they can see their bottom lip, and that kind of proportion of the top lip to the bottom lip. That's really, really important for them. The flute may need to be moved down to accommodate this, right? A student that plays consistently sharp, especially in the third octave. I've seen this far too much. You know, when we tune in band, many times we take our tuner and we go around, right, to everybody. And, you know, you check where they are with the tuner and say, oh, pull out, you're sharp. Oh, push in, pull out a mile, right? By the way, the flute should only be pulled out no more than 1/4 inch. Otherwise, the pitch starts to just go haywire. An 1/8 to 1/4 inch is actually ideal for the distance that your head joint should be pulled out of the instrument. So, for example, I'm about 1/8 inch right now. So, right? So my D major scale is relatively in tune with itself. If I pull out more than 1/4 inch, right, I'm not going to be able to play in tune with myself at all. It's the nature of the beast. The flute is not meant to be played in tune. The octaves won't be in tune if you're more than 1/4 inch pulled out. So the push in, pull out thing is only going to help so much anyway. But if you do have somebody that's consistently sharp, try not to encourage them to roll in or to cover, because again, that cuts off a good portion of our harmonic undertones. And we want to keep those in there so that it's easier for us, being on the top, tippy top of our balance pyramid, right, to tune with everybody underneath. That's how we tune, is with those harmonics and those overtones. So in terms of being too sharp, the couple things that work: have the student drop the jaw, open the teeth, right? That makes your aperture wider, and raise the soft palate. So in a student that's consistently playing too sharp in the third register, I would have them do the harmonics, right, to match harmonics with our harmonic series notes. When you get up to that third register, you know, try to manipulate the harmonic and the real note in a way that is comfortable here. We have a lot of space between the teeth. We have a nice tall, wide aperture between the lips, and then have them sing and play to try to get that soft palate a little bit higher. If the palate is higher, then the air is going to be funneled down. That's what we want, is the air to be funneled down. We don't want to actually cover the lip plate to make that happen. What happens if you have a student that can't get the second octave to speak? And this is very common in beginners. First thing that we do probably is say, oh, just blow more. And that does work. You know, we saw it with our Kincaid example that, you know, you're 10 miles an hour here and you're 20 miles an hour here. You just put in more air, you're going to get a higher note. Okay. But if, you know, if simply blowing just isn't cutting it, it's still, there's still something going on with that second octave. Check that the flute is, again, far enough down on the lower lip, because it may be that it's a little bit too high up. Maybe it was easy to get the bottom octave out with a nice high flute, and now you're trying to get the third octave or the second octave out, and it's just not working. So it's the 60-40 split that for whatever reason isn't happening. Try lowering the flute a little bit, get it nice and low, make sure that we're not covering too much of the embouchure hole. Check it again. And then if it's still not working, most likely it's that the bottom lip isn't trained yet to get the air up over the flute. So practicing a little bit of that Winnie the Pooh pucker, so you know you've got the bottom lip there, and then keep working at more air once you get the air direction the right way. right? Because it is quite frustrating when you just say, blow harder, blow harder, blow harder. And, and there's still nothing coming out, right? It's usually because then the air direction and the angle isn't quite right. So now some of this has happened just in the last year, and some of it has been, brewing longer than that. So how has being online and COVID specifically affected playing? And this goes beyond students that you may have had who have had the virus and are just rebuilding their lung capacity, because we have that with other viruses and illnesses too, like pneumonia, for example. It's very difficult to bounce back from that as a flutist. So barring all of that, what has happened with putting our lessons online? Well, some of us have developed a small sound, a really tiny round sound, because we're playing from here to our computer instead of in a much bigger space, right? And by the way, and you probably noticed this, when you have individuals playing, they are almost never playing at their max capacity. When you put them in an ensemble, all of a sudden, especially for flutists, because we're never the loudest ones, we want to compete with the rest of the sound. So we're going to be playing louder. So you may have students with a small sound individually, because that's what they've gotten used to over the last, whatever number of months. But then you put them into an ensemble and all of a sudden they're playing sharp. And so it's a little bit of a double-edged sword with this. So for the weaker sound, the smaller sound, singing and playing, that's a great one. The Taffanel and Gobert #1 is a great one. Have them do 10 jumping jacks and then play. And that is a really good way to emulate sort of nervous feeling, where your heart's pumping, your blood's flowing, and then try to play. And trying to play through that is very difficult. Trying to play through singing and playing is difficult for this student. So those things are going to really help bump up the sound. For the student that is playing sharp all the time in your ensemble because they're trying to keep up, all of the others are going to work for that, right? The nice tall embouchure, getting space between your teeth, a high soft palate, also the singing and playing. Singing and playing is good for everything. So there's a lot, that can possibly have happened with that individualized type of playing that we had last year. A flat quality. This comes from, honestly, I think it's coming from kind of leaning into the computer screen, or leaning into your stand if they had a stand at home. Check the lip placement for that 60-40 split. You don't want them to cover too much of the embouchure hole, right? Only about a third. And then even practicing with the straw again, right? Practice forming that Winnie the Pooh embouchure so that it's not too small, it's not too tight. And that, their posture, their upper body posture is sort of stacked, right? As opposed to kind of leaning. An airy tone. That happens when the embouchure is not formed small enough, right? We were talking about that dime-sized aperture earlier. Again, straw work helps with that. Changing your vowel sound helps with that somewhat, because as you change the vowel sound in your soft palate, your lips are going to change with it. So that E sound or the sound, that will help get the embouchure flatter, which is basically, what happens when your tone is too airy, you're getting too much air over the flute. Matching pitch is another issue. We have issues in matching pitch, meaning we are not flexible enough in kind of the acrobatics of what it takes to play this instrument, because we weren't matching anybody in an ensemble last year. We're just getting back into that now. So drone exercises are really great, and then the harmonics, where you're matching to yourself, is really, really important as well. I do have a handout, and I just want to quickly touch on that. And I'm going to try to pull it up here for us momentarily. So this is the handout for today, just as a recap. I gave you some tips For a correct embouchure shape, right? Forming the embouchure by saying poo, encouraging the kiss, the pucker, the frown, whatever's natural, corners not being tight, no smiling embouchure, the aperture about the size of a grain of rice, teeth being apart, the jaw and lips being flexible, third of the embouchure hole being covered, no more than that. The bottom lip being visible, and avoiding the kiss and roll. All right, those are kind of the big things, the big takeaways. And then underneath is a little troubleshooting guide. So if you have a student with a problem on the left side, you have a possible solution, and then even an exercise to give them. So on the second page here, I have taken the exercises out of the presentation and put them right into this, this handout. So what I would recommend is maybe take the left page and use that as your cheat sheet in ensemble playing, or sectionals, whatever you want to do. And then you can go ahead and give out the right sheet. I created the two middle harmonic, harmonics exercises. The top one, that's the Taffanel and Gobert, is available on IMSLP. The bottom one, the Muy Stille Sonorité, is available in print. It's Alphonse Leduc, I believe, but it's not yet out of their copyright. So I obviously didn't give you the whole exercise. There's much, much more to this. And there's a very similar one in Trevor Y as well. So if you would like to substitute that with a long tone exercise, that's also fine. So this is the basic handout that kind of covers what we discussed today. And I know that if we were in person, we could have a very lively conversation here to recap and finish this all off. But please, please, please feel free to email me if you have any questions, lsparks@uakron.edu. I do have a website that's continuously being updated, llsparks.com. And so if for whatever reason you don't get me at my Akron email, feel free to contact me through the website. I also have a YouTube page that I've got a couple, actually. I've got one that's for my flute playing. This one is my nonprofit, and my husband and I run a nonprofit called Sparks Creative, and a lot of things that we are putting up on the YouTube page right now are things like this, little flute tips, where to put your embouchure, how to create a certain kind of sound or certain kind of color, how to articulate what vibrato looks like, that kind of thing. So especially if you have any suggestions, anything that your students could really benefit from, I would love to hear it. So feel free to email me those, and I'll do my best to get some videos up and out and up on the web for you. So thank you again for coming to this digital presentation today. I wish I could have been there in person. I'm just an email away, and hopefully this helps you out a little bit in deciphering what is actually going on with this mysterious embouchure here. Since we don't play with a reed or with a mouthpiece that we touch, hopefully this gives you some tools to kind of aid your students as you work through the rest of this year. Thank you very much.